Okay, we are live again. So welcome back after the intermission. And so for those of you who are just joining us, we're talking with author Lexie Bean. Which pronouns are you going by at the moment?
I go by they or he. Express.
They or he. Thank you. Um, and also joined here by Danielle Snow, they, them, theirs. And I am the director of LBGT Student Services. Pronouns I use are he and his. Just a reminder for those of us who are on the WebEx, if you do not want to be on the live stream, to keep yourself muted, video and audio wise. And I will now give the mic to Danielle and Lexie.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nathan, for figuring out all the technology. And thank you so much, Lexie, for being here. Just real quick before we jump into conversation, just wanted to give an absolutely shameless plug for this book if you have not already purchased it and you would like to. Um, as Lexie was mentioning during our intermission, there are not only physical copies, you can get them, but there is an audiobook, so that's super great, super helpful. And if you'd like, you can go, and if you're in the Kalamazoo area, you can go to our local BookBug / This Is a Bookstore and purchase it directly in store. I know that they have a couple copies because I just went in and got my physical copy. But I also posted in our WebEx chat the link to order online if you would like. Absolutely no pressure, but also like pretty cool book, pretty wonderful book. So with that, I would love to pass it over to you, Lexie, to talk about why you chose to read what you chose today and your thoughts and your feelings around it.
Yeah, thank you. I'll offer a little bit of context too for people who might be missing some of the reading half of this conversation. But I read 3 chapters, and all of them. Well, I'll go one by one. So the first one spoke to the feeling of being in bed at night and time passing and wanting to remember that you have a body again. And the strategy that Rowan offered in that particular chapter was something that I did when I was a child and a teenager. I would feel for my ribs, and that's kind of like a subtle but not nod to the intersection between eating disorders and having and wanting and desiring and needing a sense of control, and also being a survivor of childhood sexual abuse. For me, I got very scared when I couldn't find my ribs because then I wasn't sure if I had a body. Um, I felt like I was free. I was free floating. Um, and that is thankfully a strategy I don't use anymore. But I do want to acknowledge people who might still be in that space of desiring control where you can find it, and how hard it can be to sleep. And Rowan, the narrator of this book, The Ship We Built, each chapter is a letter that's attached to a balloon. And I mentioned this in the introduction, but um, one of the reasons he does that is to maybe make a friend. But also, each letter is written at night. Each letter is written at a time where he needs to help himself end the day. Um, and he's writing it out as a way to essentially allow himself to end the day. So he doesn't have to think these things anymore or feel these things, or to maybe feel like maybe someone out there will listen and hear it one day. Um, and all that being said, um, each chapter is a lullaby. And so like that practice that he had of feeling for his body, feeling for his bones, which is you know, not the healthiest way to to find grounding, or to find a sense of self. He also has writing, which is a more positive and healthy form of ending his day, of finding himself, of expressing his relationship with his own body, especially his mind and his heart and his hands. So that was essentially the first chapter that I read. And for those of you who might read in the future, I believe it was the December 24th chapter. And then I read from the December 27th chapter a few days later, and he brings the reader on a journey from his bedroom to a space behind the tree. Again, that was something that I did. There's a lot of my coping mechanisms are in this book, for better and for worse. Oh, yeah. I also love sitting behind the Christmas tree at my house growing up. It made me feel like I had a a closer proximity to like faith, celebration, wonder than I would if I was away from the tree. And so I really wanted to be as close to it as possible, which I kind of took to an extreme by being really pressed up against it. But I also loved the feeling of hiding, slipping out of my room and hiding. And in this particular chapter, I think it's a really good example for how a lot of survivors, but in particular childhood sexual abuse survivors, speak to their abuse at the time it's happening or within a short retrospective period. In this chapter, and also in the book as a whole, but especially in this chapter, he doesn't say what happens. He doesn't have language for what happened. It's the 90s, he's 10, but also he's still in it, so he needs to survive, and to name something while you're still in it can sometimes feel really scary and even dangerous, and even can be life-threatening in a very particular way. So for him, he navigates his abuse by describing the sounds and the colors, the objects that witness him, the sounds and the colors that he'll remember when he can't remember anything else. And for me, that's all I had for him. For at least 10 years, that was all I really had, were sounds and colors and shapes. So things similar to what Rowan described. And I think there's a lot of value in that, both because this is technically a children's book. It gives the reader, especially your young readers, space to disengage or not notice when they maybe don't want to, or they're not ready to. But also I'm kind of against this expectation that survivors must speak directly to their abuse at all times in order to be believed, or in order to have a narrative that other people can understand. And I think this is especially true within the context of trigger warnings. The idea that like, oh, to be triggered by something, we have to name something, we have to be graphic about something. But often violence is experienced in these small everyday objects. The shadow, the color of the walls, the stuffed animal that was just sitting there the whole time, the window that bounces back your reflection. So these are the things that also hold the violence, and the things that are so hard to explain, but things we carry with us. So that's that's why I read that chapter, the December 27th chapter. But even if you don't read it, I hope you can hold and remember something from what I just shared from my own experience, or from an abstracted synopsis of what I had read. And the last chapter I read was about a strategy that we had in terms of relationship building and asking for help. He and his friend Sophie take turns putting rocks on each other's porches as a way to indicate that they're okay. And there's a few reasons I wanted to read that chapter, especially when thinking about my experience in college. And one of the big ones is how Rowan talks about how he put a rock on Sophie's porch to say that he was okay, to assure that he was okay even when he wasn't, because he wanted his friend to not worry, and because he believed that his friend had a better home life, which was true to a degree. He wanted to feel belonging and sometimes to speak to just to speak to things that are so hard and so big and so immediate that we can risk our sense of belonging. And I don't blame Rowan for doing that. I think everyone has done that at some point. But to survive a family structure where to speak to the truth could implode everything that you know, what you go back to during the holidays. There's a real risk there. And so I don't blame Rowan for not telling Sophie at that point. I also think that there are moments where he is okay and he believes that he's okay. And sometimes being okay means just holding the right object as a kid. The ways that we cope as a young person, but also as adults too, are really so deep and magnificent. And I think a big part of my adulthood survivorship has been trying to reclaim some of those strategies I used as a kid, the depth and the safety that can come with imagination and ordinary objects. I think the last thing I want to say that all these chapters spoke to at some point was that Rowan is a trans boy, and this is very much intertwined into Rowan's story throughout the entire book. But because Rowan, and I was I statements too, and also I lacked not only lacked male role models, but was directly abused by the cisgendered man and men. The idea of claiming boyhood is so overwhelming at times because it raises the question of becoming. What will one become? Will it be anything like that person who has done those things? And the thought of that, for me, has been very destabilizing. And I'm thankful for writing this book so I can insert some of that into Rowan's journey. And then the last thing I'll say before passing it along is a question that Danielle actually asked me during intermission. They asked me to potentially speak to the highs and the lows of the text, like from paragraph to paragraph. Rowan is feeling all sorts of ways, and that was a very intentional choice on my part. I think especially the fact that this book touches on childhood sexual abuse. There's this idea that childhood survivors and survivors in general must be down all the time. And that's not true. Like, one must find reasons to live. And especially in the format of this book, Rowan is writing these letters to maybe a new friend. And I really believe Rowan wants to protect the reader too. So there was a point when I was reading where Rowan said, I don't want to tell you about this anymore. He's protecting the reader as much as he's protecting himself. And the amount of care that he has for the reader and therefore you. is very special and really can inform the ways that he sort of rejiggers himself throughout the text. Yeah, preservation, and also like there are reasons to live and there are reasons to wonder and play with.
Wow, Lexie, thank you so much for offering us all of this perspective, offering us like such a closeness, even more closeness to Rowan, and for also telling us the parts of it that are also related to you and to your experiences. I'm just grateful in so many ways, but especially grateful to know some of these more in-depth intricacies and complexities to it. Yeah. So I do have a couple questions, things that I'm wondering just as my own human, but also things that I think maybe other people are wondering too. But as I'm asking questions, if folks here in the WebEx space also have questions, please feel free to ask them in the chat. You can either post them for everyone to see, or you can also privately message me, and I can make sure to not state your name if you are uninterested in that. But I'll just jump into my first question, which in some ways has kind of been talked about a little bit, but I'm wondering if we could go a little bit more in depth if you feel comfortable. And I'd also love to name that as I'm asking questions, if there's stuff that you do not want to answer, you absolutely do not have to. So my first one here is I'm just kind of wondering if you could talk a little bit about your writing process for this book, kind of what that looked like for you, and especially like how did you tap into this child perspective as you were reading? Like I really just kept thinking like a 10-year-old must have written this, right? Like this like feels so that childhood, that imagination that you were speaking to. And then also I'm wondering, and I can put this question in the chat so that you can also see it, but with knowing that some of the themes of this book include loneliness and addiction and abuse and so much more, how did you also take care of yourself while writing this book?
Mm. All very good questions. So the process was, I think the first thing I'll say is, had I started this process thinking I was gonna write a novel, I never would have started it. Um, like, there's no way. The very first draft was more of like a picture book. It was more of a Valentine, for one person who I had a really big crush on. So I had a muse. And then after I wrote it, I became obsessed with this narrator who didn't have a name at the time, and the friend that they were so close to. I became obsessed with it. So I kept playing with this story over the course of several years in very different mediums. I at first thought maybe it's going to be a picture book, and then I thought maybe it's going to be a series of poems or like little lullabies. Um, and then I thought maybe it would be kind of like inspired by The Little Prince, which is like largely imaginative, like very loose plot, heavy illustration, but sort of long. Um, and then I kept working on it, and then I had a big breakup and had a lot of feelings. So then I channeled those feelings into a longer, more in-depth draft, and then it became a novel. But then it was also a series of collages. It's been a playlist. It's been it's been even a screenplay. I have a screenplay version that I wrote at the same time as this, kind of to help me. Oh, okay. Uh, this is great. This is really good. Um, um,
Oh, so
okay.
much love.
Yeah, it was also a playlist. I already said that. Okay. Anyways, it's been so many different versions, and I think the reason I was able to finish it was because I wasn't attached to what form it would take. And so that gave me like excitement around it, curiosity. But it also made me feel less stuck on what it would look like and therefore more open. Like, okay, now I can focus better. Sorry. Sorry, but not sorry. Yeah. Um, yeah, I think that helped me a lot of just of keeping like excitement around it and also being less competitive with it, which can be a real imagination suck and a real suck of even joy. Um, and then tapping into child perspective, one thing that helped a lot for earliest drafts is I wrote them by hand with crayon. Um, yes, a lot of the earliest drafts, I would even like kind of hold it like this, kind of like how I did even at the age of 10. I was still holding my utensils like this. Sometimes gel pens. I would use the utensils that I used to use essentially, and that helps so much. With writing by hand, there's less room to censor my thoughts.
That is
um,
amazing. I'm like reeling from that. That's so wonderful.
yeah, a good excuse to also get some fun gel pens. The other thing that honestly helped is a little less like whimsical. So that was around the time my abuse at home really escalated. And so I really believe that a part of me will always be stuck at that age. I think a part of me stopped there. And often in my adulthood, I have felt really embarrassed about that and ashamed about that and frustrated with that. And this is one of the only ways I've been able to engage with it that has felt like, aha, like I'm not ashamed of this right now. So that perspective came very naturally to me. Um, and I guess that is a great segue into how did I take care of myself? It's hard. Um, I think it helped that it took 6 years to write. I that made room to, for the most part, work with my own deadline. I think it also helped to keep in my mind the audience as small as possible. This is some of the like best writing advice I've gotten from someone else, and I can't remember who said it. I would like to remember sometime. But they said, yeah, basically make your audience one person. And that really helps me because had I written this thinking, oh my God, anyone in the world could read this, anyone who can find this book can read a lot of my thoughts and fears and coping mechanisms, some good, some bad. I don't know if I would have written as honestly as I did. And I think I would have just lost my mind to be so uh, stuck in other people's thoughts. But if I can focus on, that 10-year-old version of myself, or even the first person that I ever wrote a draft for, if I could just focus on that, then I was going to be okay because I could meet that person with love. Um, Another thing that was very helpful is very counter to a lot of advice I've heard other writers give. um, some writers say you need to write every day. Nah, I don't think that. I really don't. Personally, I don't support that, especially when writing is so personal. Like, why would I do that to myself? Um, So when I was on deadline, and I could have had that in my brain, like, you need to write every day, or else you're not a real author, or else like you're gonna become less good, or you're not gonna finish, or all these things. I would find another way to write. So that being said, I would watch a movie that I thought Rowan would like, and I would take notes on the movie based off what I thought he would think of it. I would make a playlist. I would make a collage. I would like watch commercials from 1997. I would find another way to engage with the ultimate project without forcing myself to disclose anything. And I think the last big thing that was so helpful I mentioned before already, which is that because Rowan also wants to protect himself and Rowan also wants to protect his reader, there is there is inherently like a call for me to do that while writing too. If I feel like the line where I'm like, I don't want to talk about this anymore, that I read earlier, like that was my thought too. Just being like, given all this context that's happening, how Rowan might be feeling on this day, how I'm feeling on this day. Yeah, I don't want to talk about this anymore. And anyone should be allowed to say that. Even if it's a book that's about survivorhood, like, yeah, maybe I don't feel like talking about it. I can set those boundaries. Um, yeah.
Oh, wow. Oh my gosh. Thank you so much for speaking to all these, especially my 80 million questions in one kind of go. Um, but
You're welcome.
yes, I just really appreciate, especially as somebody who's also a survivor, as somebody who works with survivors, the way that you talk about boundaries and consent and where violence is placed and where we find it, where we remember it. It's just um gosh, wow, just amazing. So thank you for all of those pieces. And I think kind of leads me into my next question. So I have a little script written for myself because I wanted to have it framed in a specific way. So I'm going to read from that. But one of the reasons that Lexie and I had wanted to have this book reading and conversation around this time was one, we know that many LGBTQ individuals have had to be stuck in living in unsafe and unsupportive environments, just in general, but especially due to COVID-19 and all these other reasons. And two, we know that there are probably WMU students or anybody else who might be watching this video who could be going home for the holidays to these same or similar unsafe and unsupportive environments. So with that, I'm just kind of wondering if you could talk about maybe not necessarily your experiences per se, but more, um, yeah, I guess just how you were called to interweave your experiences into Rowan's story, into this story, and then two, just kind of giving you a little bit of space of like what do you want to say to folks, or what would you maybe want to say, maybe what would Rowan want to say to folks who are potentially going back to or currently living in these kinds of environments. Yeah, I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you. So my immediate response is actually, so earlier in the pandemic, I was asked this question by Rain. And for folks who don't know it, RAIN is the Rape, Assault, Incest National Network. Um, and uh, so I said a response to that question, obviously. And then shortly after that, a friend and I made a video, a short film called A Scavenger Hunt for People Loneliest in Their Own Homes. And it's essentially my response to that question. So I think I'm going to just put the link in this chat to respond to that question, if that's okay.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you
Yeah,
for sharing it. I really appreciate it.
yeah. I'll say a thing or two about the video, so I'm not like totally throwing out the question into a separate link. But the short film that my friend and I made is called a scavenger hunt for people loneliest in their own homes. And it was honestly largely inspired by one of the chapters I was referencing earlier, where I talked about how Rowan relied on objects to get through those hard times where he really felt like he had to be there. And, because he's a minor, there is that extra obligation there. But people can still feel that obligation at any age. Um, yeah, how objects can be objects for staying, objects for leaving. They can be witnesses, they can hold memory. And even when everyone's gaslighting you, at least there are objects that will remember. There will be songs that will remember. And yeah, so this video is essentially a guide, um, like a 7-minute guide to listen to or watch, because it's a video too, when feeling overwhelmed. Um, mm. I think something that was helpful for me as a student, especially, and I had to go back. Oh gosh, it was really hard. But I something that was helpful for me was like having text games with friends. And the rock on the porch is kind of like this, where it's like a way to check in with friends without having to say any words. Well, without having to explicitly answer like the how are you question, especially if you don't know how sound travels. Um, and to be honest with you, this is the first year I said no to going back to my home state for the holiday. Even though my situation has changed pretty drastically since my childhood, it still doesn't feel healthy for me, and at times it doesn't feel safe for me. Because of a particular person who's there. So this is the first year where I've decided to say no and stay where I am for the holiday. And my mom's gonna come visit me instead of me going there. And I think just knowing that like I have that option as an adult and reflecting on the fact that I actually might have been able to have that option in college and I just didn't know it. I just don't think anyone told me that. So I guess I'm telling whoever needs to hear that maybe that that could be an option. I know it comes with its own challenges, its own big conversations and fuss. Um, but if it's something that is resonating with you, listen to your instincts.
Thank you so much. And especially, I think, thank you for saying that you said no this year. Like, I think it's so wonderful to be able to hear folks who have put up those boundaries and to know, like, hey, that person did it, so maybe I can too. So thank you, and for everything that you shared, especially to this video. I am so, I don't know, excited isn't the right word to say to watch it, but I am feeling really appreciative that I will have a chance to watch it.
Yeah.
Um, so we have a question from the audience. So this person writes, my brain is a bit jumbled right now anyways, so just kind of prefacing that a little bit, but as a survivor, do you think that there is a connection between our healing processes with past traumas or complex feelings and then one's writing or artistic projects or process? Basically, some people believe that working through them or going to therapy makes their art worse, and some people believe that you have to have all the answers to make it into art. So just kind of wondering your thoughts about that.
Wow. Yeah, it's so interesting to hear both of those narratives side by side. I've like heard them both separately, but to hear them side by side is so interesting. Thank you. Your jumbled brain paid off because it uh, has made me think about that in a different way. Thank you. And it's also a really good question. I think for myself, I don't want to speak for everyone, um, but I will say for myself, I have tried to do work before as a martyr. This particularly happened with anthologies I made in the past. The most recent one's called Written on the Body, and it's full of letters that trans survivors of domestic violence and sexual abuse wrote to their body parts. And while I made this anthology, I stayed in a sexually abusive relationship for 3 years throughout the entire creation process of this book. And for anthology making, I'm put in the position of supporting many other people and also producing an object. And I think to a certain degree, I used that project as a way to not deal with myself. But then a beautiful thing happened where when the book eventually came out tangibly, I used it as a way to hold myself accountable to leave that relationship. So it can go both ways, sacrificing ourselves or holding ourselves accountable. But I think the biggest lesson there that I mentioned at the very beginning of this mental paragraph, which is I don't think anyone should be a martyr for their work. It's not worth it. It's not worth it. I've done that in the past, even before the example I just gave, and it really just made me want to quit everything. It made me want to quit friendships. It made me want to quit uh, living in the United States at all. it, I left the country. I really just wanted to disappear because I worked on some things that maybe I wasn't ready for, or maybe I was ready for it, but I didn't have the resources to properly deal with the aftermath of creating work related to these themes. And I think this is especially something to consider when doing survivor content and knowing that the person who directly caused you harm um, is still not only in the world, but in the world and not dealing um, with their own stuff that had led them to cause you harm. Um, yeah, I never thought I would make something again after that. So I really froze up for a few years. And I feel sad that, especially queer people and trans people, that there's this expectation that we owe people our stories, and I feel like that's unfair. There are some parts of us that can be just for us or just for a certain group of people. We don't owe anything, and I think it's even, maybe it's controversial, but whatever. I think it's even gotten to the point where people have created this idea of queerness and transness where, like, if you don't have trauma, therefore you're not really queer or trans. And that's unfair too. um, to say that someone has to, has to have a certain checklist of experiences in order to be a real anything, and that includes artist. That includes artist. There are a lot of beautiful and loving things in the world to create from that aren't just pain. And sometimes the depths of both happen at the same time. And I really thought about that when making the ship we built. Like, it's the depths of both. And had I pursued working on this book without letting it take 6 years, without joining a support group, without being really explicit with my own healing process, I don't know if I would have survived this writing process, and I don't want to romanticize that. And I don't know if I would have been as truthful as I ended up being. Because had I had major blocks, healing undone on particular elements of the story that allowed the story to live and be true, then they wouldn't have been written down. They wouldn't have been processed, because I wouldn't have gotten to that point of my healing. And okay, this is the last thing I'll say. This is a very good question. Thank you for asking it. I hope what I'm saying is helpful, and if not, that's okay too. Had I not been at where I'm at in my healing process, and I worked on this with a publisher where I'm getting the feedback of many other people, professional people who are deciding whether or not this book even goes through, but also the public. If I wasn't at my current place in healing and they gave me feedback I wasn't ready for, the work would not only suffer, it would push me way further back. And maybe even push the project further back, because having a meltdown while in a professional meeting isn't cute. Like, it's just, that's just how it is. And it was frankly really hard for me to get feedback at times, about elements of Rowan's story, specifically related to the abuse part. And I'm, for the most part, proud of myself for how I handled that feedback, because then I was able to hear it. I was able to come back with suggestions. I was able to come back with compromises, where I think past version of myself, had I received that same feedback, would have been like, I'm quitting this altogether, or it would have been a big fuck you, or it would have been like changing my story in a way that wouldn't have felt good in order to appease to the other person. So yeah, I worry about people. I really do worry about people who say that suffering is required to create. I don't want to say too much more about that, but that's a big concern. And I also worry about people who say that you need to be healed through everything in order to create, because then who will ever create anything? It's never done. Yeah, it's not done still, but I'm definitely in a better place where I can hold things. So, let's be non-binary about it, I guess.
Oh my goodness. I feel like you said so many wonderful and powerful things. I'm so grateful we're live streaming this so I can refer back to it personally. But especially that last bit, right? Of like, if we waited until we were healed to like do whatever it might be, whether it's creating or something else, like no one would be doing anything, right? Like that's just the name of the game with healing is that it's so continuous. It's such a journey. Um,
Yes.
so yes,
Yeah.
thank you. Thank you so much, Lexie. Oh, sorry, were you going to say more?
I just wanted to add that, especially with social media, there's this idea of like anything could be like half baked and then shared widely.
Mhm,
Um, and I think like that that can kind of create this like sort of cultural dynamic of uh like you owe your story to everyone, or a cultural dynamic of um like how much healing one has to do in order to share anything.
mhm. Yeah,
It's messy.
it is messy and imperfect, and yeah. Well, thank you so much for everything. I'm realizing we're about 3 minutes over the time that we were planning for. So thank you for these extra 3 minutes. And I want to be respectful of not taking any more extra minutes. So thank you everyone for being here. Thank you for anyone who might be watching this later on. And thank you especially to Lexie for just really, I mean, this immense vulnerability, this immense authenticity that you have offered us this evening. So yes, Nathan, is there anything else you would like to add or say to conclude this evening? Or Lexie, is there anything else you wanted to add to conclude?
No, just really thankful for that helpful advice, and I particularly like the part of like you don't have to write every day as someone who's getting their PhD and will eventually write a dissertation. That's maybe that's not in quite the same context, but I do appreciate hearing that, and I do like that it can ebb and flow, right? And the healing part can ebb and flow, and appreciate the space that you're able to kind of walk us through process and your boundaries and all how folks can also set up their own boundaries. So it's just super helpful for holidays, particularly for us queer folks. Uh, I do like the idea of like you can always say no. You're not obligated to family just because you're blood related. So yeah, just really reinforcing that message as we get closer to not only the holidays but also finals. Um, it's a very stressful time. Holidays and family, one thing, and then you add academic progress is another thing, and is just a perfect storm. Uh, I will say that, again, students are welcome to come to the Office of LBGT Student Services. We are hosting study jams the week of finals, Monday through Wednesday. So if you need to come into the office and scream, that is an option. Or if you need to come into the office to study in a queer space, that is also an option. I'm sure you can also go into a fireplace as well and hang out in there. So whichever one you feel comfortable with. If you need to vent, if you need to find resources, if you need just a queer space and be reinforced that, hey, you got folks here at Western that love you and support you, um, and are not judgmental about who you are in any way. So thank you again, Lexie. This is amazing. Really great to have this. Really glad that Danielle managed to connect us uh, and make this happen.
Grateful too. Thank you so much. And yeah, for anyone who's listening, I encourage you to do at least one nice thing for yourself before the day ends. Um, Even if it's a 10-second motion or action, I encourage you to go for it.
And so I will end our live stream, and at the I will tell y'all when I end it. And so if folks want to still hang around and ask a few questions of our author, we can do that without being on YouTube and Facebook and so on and so forth. So thank you again. I'm going to stop